Good afternoon, good evening, colleagues from Trinidad and Tobago. Welcome to the Caribbean Public Health Agency's Biosafety and Biosecurity webinar series. And this is being held in collaboration with the Caribbean Public Health Laboratory Network and our partners from the US CDC's World Health Organization's Collaborating Center on Biosafety and Biosecurity, and our close friends from the CDC's Caribbean Regional Office, and we'll hear from these persons in a little bit. But I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you who have joined us from not only the Caribbean member states and CARPHA member states, but from countries around the world. And at this time, I would invite persons to type in the chat your name, your affiliation, and where you're from. We would also capture this information through the registration, but it's always nice to see where persons are joining us from. We encourage you to use the chat box function and the Q&A box to place your messages or questions, comments into during the course of the proceedings. And so it's a great privilege for us at CARPHA to be able to launch this webinar series on the new seminal document from the World Health Organization, the 4th edition of the Laboratory Biosafety Manual. We fondly call it the LBM4. And it's a great honor to be able to work in close collaboration with WHO, PAHO, CDC, and speakers throughout the series who have been instrumental in the drafting and development of this document as well. Just as to remind us, the objective is to provide an update to you in this particular session on the changes to the new biosafety manual. And we encourage you to register and attend the upcoming sessions that will run straight through into September, looking at specific topics of this document. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker for opening remarks, and that's our dear Executive Director, Dr. Joy St. John of Caribbean Public Health Agency. Dr. St. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning and welcome to over 100 participants joining us from all over the world for the launch of CARPHA's webinar series on the new World Health Organization's Laboratory Biosafety Manual 4th edition, which was released in December 2020. This 5-part series will run from June to September, and we encourage you to complete the entire series with us. This series forms part of the capacity building component of CARPHA's Laboratory Biosafety and Biosecurity Program, which aims to expand the regional cadre of biorisk management experts and promote the use of sustainable biological risk management practices using common educational materials to improve local capacities in this critical aspect for sustainable, resilient national health systems. More than a year on, dealing with the emergence and devastation caused by SARS-CoV-2, the virus which has produced COVID-19, and now the variants of concern. Laboratories such as yours continue to provide yeoman service under trying conditions. It is our hope that the sessions we have prepared will empower you to take stock, to improve your daily routines, to work safely and securely, and to provide you with a range of available tools to do so. I understand that this new LBM4 takes a risk-based approach to determining the types and levels of risk posed in your specific settings. And this is much better for sustainability of measures, which may need to be implemented. I wish to commend PAHO and the WHO for the highly collaborative and consultative approach which was taken in the development of this key document. CARPHA wishes to acknowledge the tremendous collaborative efforts of our featured speaker, Dr. Christina Schiel of the WHO Collaborating Center for Biosafety and Biosecurity at the US Centers for Disease Control, Dr. Kaz Kojima from WHO headquarters, who has supported this process from day one, and our regional counterpart, Ms. Giselle Guevara from the CDC Caribbean Regional Office, who continues to work closely with Sasha. We are also very pleased to have Dr. Jean-Marc Gavestu, PAHO's advisor in public health laboratory services and networking. Colleagues from Mexico's Institute of Epidemiological Diagnosis and Reference, INDRE, national focal points, and those from across the globe. I look forward to receiving the activities report, including feedback from you participants as to the usefulness and applicability of these sessions and how we can better serve your needs. Thank you. And I really hope we have as exciting a seminar as I suspect we will. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. St. John, for those encouraging remarks. And now at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jean-Marc Gavestu, Regional Advisor of Public Health Laboratory Services and Networking of the PAHO WHO office, based in Mexico now. And on a personal note, a very key mentor in my professional development in biosafety and biosecurity over the years. Dr. Gavestu, welcome to you, and over.
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of Dr. CariPHLN, Director of the Pan American Health Organization, Dr. St. John, Executive Director of CARPHA, thank you very much for this kind invitation. My dear Sasha Valasarkar Singh, thank you very much and congratulations for organizing this very, very important webinar series. This is the first event associated with the launching of the new edition of the WHO Laboratory Safety Manual, the 4th edition. You made the highest level of expert at global level with the participation of my colleague, Dr. Kaz Kojima from WHO, representative from WHO, but also two collaborating centers. First of all, Dr. Christina Schiel in representation of the CDC of the USA, and you have kindly invited the INDRE Mexico, that is also a WHO collaborating center, for further multiplication in Latin America and to strengthen the network of WHO collaborating center in biosafety in our region, associating, of course, CDC, but also the Public Health Agency of Canada. We met 2 years ago in Mexico in order to strengthen this concept of networking. This event is timely, very accurate in order to fight COVID pandemic, but also to prepare the response to new epidemics and pandemics, as WHO mentioned in all its interventions. So I would like to wish you success, and definitively, I love you. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jean-Marc. You always have a special place in our hearts here at CARPHA, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Trinidad and Tobago and to continue working with you at regional and global levels. Okay, at this time, I would like to introduce you to the architect, supervisor, chief cook and bottle washer of this entire production of the LBM4 and the person who is advocating on behalf of all of us at the World Health Organization's headquarters, Dr. Kaz Kojima, who has been a very instrumental person working alongside not only those in WHO headquarters and the regional offices, but sparing the time to answer questions from agencies such as CARPHA. And we do appreciate his presence and the time he's given to be part of the launch of this series. So Dr. Kaz, I welcome you to the floor.
Thanks so much indeed. Greetings from Geneva. I'm Kaz Kojima, responsible for biosafety and biosecurity here at WHO headquarters. And thank you, the organizer, in particular, Dr. St. John, Sasha, and the rest of the CariPHLN team, as well as the main speaker, Dr. Schiel of US CDC, PAHO colleague, and esteemed participants. I'm very pleased and excited to see this webinar delivered today in dissemination of our biosafety program's flagship document, that is Laboratory Biosafety Manual 4th edition, also known as LBM4. This document was developed thanks to our great collaborators, of course, including Chris. With its novel evidence and risk-based approach, we are aiming at better serving our global community for helping attain equitable access to necessary laboratory testing and research work without jeopardizing safety. It sounds like a magic, but it's reality. So more details and context will be discussed by Chris. A couple of weeks ago, World Health Assembly was held in Geneva, where biosafety was one of the key agenda items this time. And many countries, including the Caribbean representative, expressed their support for LBM4 and its revision, concept, and further promotion, including training and tool development. So risk-based approach is built upon the foundation of proper risk assessment. This webinar will support, of course, this, but I believe this is not the end, but rather our collaboration should continue in many respects, as Sasha mentioned. Please do feel free to let us know exactly what you'd like to learn more and in what way we could provide better support for you all. And your voice is critical for us to shape our program. Once again, thank you very much indeed. And back to you, Sasha.
Thank you, Dr. Kaz. This time, I'd like to welcome one of CARPHA's key supporters in the region. And again, on a personal note, Ms. Giselle Guevara, who is the laboratory strengthening team lead for the US CDC's Caribbean Regional Office, was the individual that basically gave me my first lesson in quality management systems and ISO 15189 and 17025 way back when. And so it's a pleasure to introduce Giselle. And Giselle will be introducing our featured speaker today. So Giselle, over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Christina Schiel. Dr. Christina Schiel holds a PhD in cellular biology from the University of Georgia in the United States of America and has served as a public health scientist at CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, since 2001. Dr. Schiel began her career at the laboratory bench as a research scientist and has led many efforts across CDC to improve lab biosafety throughout her tenure. Since 2016, she has championed global enhancement of biosafety and biosecurity in the Center for Global Health and currently leads a WHO collaborating center for biosafety and biosecurity on behalf of CDC. I welcome Dr. Schiel to give us her presentation on the LBM4. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Giselle. And I thank everyone here for this invitation. I'm so excited to share my knowledge of the LBM4 and what's new with all of you. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get started and share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen okay?
Not yet.
Not
Not
yet?
just yet.
Okay, hold on. Let me try again. I think I might have missed the button. Okay, here. Mhm.
Yes.
Now?
There
Okay,
we go,
perfect.
yes. And then
Thank
go to
you.
slideshow.
All right.
Excellent.
So I'm going to be talking about what's new in the LBM4, and there are quite a lot of things. But as you know, was mentioned earlier on already by some of our esteemed colleagues, that this laboratory biosafety manual is really a revolutionary compared to previous manuals. It's based on biological risk assessment. And that's one of the key features, but there are others I'm going to share with you. So I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much again. And we're off. Hold on 1 second. So the Laboratory Biosafety Manual basically provides guidance for laboratory sharing of best practices. And I think a lot of you know this, but one of the features is that it is not legally binding like IHR. It is a guidance document and actually serves as de facto regulatory document in some countries that may not have their own regulatory documents in place. I think that's really important because it also serves as kind of a guideline for countries to develop their own regulations based on this manual, which is shared globally. It's referenced not only by diverse sectors, including the biopharma industry, the food industry, but also by various types of laboratories, research, diagnostic, and so on. And so what this allows for is global sharing of biosafety best practices and principles. And so let me go ahead and stop my video. All right. Okay, there we go. So next I'd like to discuss what I would call the evolution of biosafety. The first laboratory biosafety manual published by WHO was 1983. And this document basically encouraged countries to accept and implement basic concepts in biological safety, also to develop national codes of practice for safe handling of pathogenic biological agents in their laboratories. In 1993, a second iteration was published, and then in 2004, the LBM3 was introduced. And many of you are probably familiar with the LBM3 because LBM4 was just published in December. This manual stressed the importance of personal responsibility for laboratory biosafety, and it introduced new chapters on risk assessment, safe use of recombinant DNA technology, which is burgeoning at the time, and transport of infectious materials. These earlier versions of the LBM, 1983, 1993, and 2004, described laboratory containment in terms of specific biosafety levels, which we're all familiar with. This approach was somewhat rigid and did not always take situational factors and circumstances into account, such as specific procedures being performed and personnel training and experience. This actually, between the biosafety levels, 0 through 4, 1 through 4, and then risk groups assigned to pathogens, which still do exist, they're called risk or hazard groups, there was a big misconception, because they're also 1 through 4, that pathogens of certain risk groups had to be handled within laboratories of a corresponding biosafety level. And this has been kind of ongoing for several years and is also true in many other agencies, even at CDC with their manual, the same problem exists. So in 2020, the LBM4 was published, and it uses biological risk assessment as a foundation for all biosafety best practices. Today, I'm going to be describing this and some of the other changes in the LBM-4. So another important aspect of the LBM-4 is that it's evidence-based. The LBM-4 is evidence-based and relies on the principle that transparent assessment of risks allows safety measures to be balanced with the actual risk of working with biological agents, and this is on a case-by-case or contextual basis. The figure on the right shown here is from Kinman and others in 2008, and it shows the contextual aspect of biosafety measures. Also, the importance of the initial risk assessment in determining the appropriate biosafety containment and controls to be used in any type of procedure in the laboratory. We also know that the strength of the evidence base, as it increases the strength of our biosafety principles and practices. And so this is constantly under review. And an example that I'd like to share with you is the OIE, which is the World Organization for Animal Health Chatham House effort, which is a biosafety research roadmap for specific pathogens. It's a paper-based review of the evidence available for current biosafety practices related to laboratory-acquired infections and environmental releases. And this is designed to determine whether the current biosafety practices are adequate or whether they can be improved in any way. And then recommendations will be made based on this evidence. And that's the whole point. I think the evidence-based approach is extremely critical. Also, there is kind of a call amongst many out here, and I'm sure you've heard it, about biosafety research, applied biosafety research. There's not a lot of publications out there. And so as we perform applied biosafety research, and I'm talking bench level research on, say, disinfectants and inactivation protocols, things like that, sharing of this information once the evidence is clear will help to inform best practices. So this is my way of encouraging you all to be involved in doing that, because we do want to always be working towards strengthening biosafety practices via the evidence base. Another important aspect of the approach to biosafety in the LBM-4, with the risk assessment as its foundation, is that it's very process driven, and can be used throughout the life cycle of the sample for all the processes involved. It also is aligned with OIE's revision of their terrestrial manual, and so it actually espouses the One Health concept, which is something that's growing all the time, and for good reason. An example would be bacteria that acquire resistance to antibiotics are directly related, and this is evidence-based, to cattle on, CAFOs. So I think, that and other zoonotic infections, this kind of pulls people together around the same set of principles and practices, and I think that's critically important moving forward. And that wasn't always the case. So another aspect of the approach to biosafety in the Laboratory Biosafety Manual 4 is that it can be applied by all laboratories of member countries and not, irrespective of their resources. As you know, some laboratories are very well outfitted and have a lot of resources, whereas some maybe rural laboratories in hospitals do not have a lot of resources. And on the right, you can see examples of photographs that somewhat represent what I'm talking about. So the audience for the LBM-4 varies greatly. The great thing about the LBM-4 is that it's situational. It can be applied by all laboratories. And it's based on what you have, your resources that are available, the actual conditions under which the pathogen will be manipulated, how it will be manipulated, where it will be manipulated, by whom. And, these things are very important. It's very situational. And so it makes the process equitable. And this wasn't the case with kind of rigid laboratory biosafety levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, where, you might say, well, I don't have, a BSc, I really can't do this work. But as you'll see moving forward, the whole process of risk assessment is, looking at many factors and controlling risk. And so that's not always going to be the case. All right. So here's a very simple example of what a biological risk assessment is. Basically, you're looking at the biological agent, which is the hazard, which in that sense, any consequences of biological release of that agent or accidental infection, what are the consequences of that? So that is the hazard you're looking at. What are the consequences? If I were to get sick from this agent through some error or breach in safety, what would be the consequences? And this versus the process, which is the likelihood. How likely is it that I am going to make a mistake or that someone is going to make a mistake with the biological controls we have in place? And you need to look at that process and you compare the two and you say, if this is, it's the likelihood of this happening plus the severity of harm, and that's together, those two things actually are comprised of risk. In other words, risk looks at both of those factors. And so I'll show you a better example on the next page. So it'll hopefully make it a little bit more clear. But I think a lot of people now understand this, that it's likelihood of an incident plus consequence equals risk. All right. So biological risk assessment, I've kind of showed you the simplified version, but I'd really like to show you, talk a little bit more about it. And so here we have a heat map on the left that shows not only the consequence of exposure and the likelihood of release, and that's on the x-axis, and then how that relates to some biocontainment measures, for heightened control, core requirements, etc. As you can see, the consequence of release or exposure increases as you go up the y-axis or to the right of the x-axis. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this would work. The consequence of exposure is entirely dependent on the pathogen or pathogens involved. That is one thing that really cannot be changed unless you change the pathogen. Factors including pathogenicity, virulence, transmissibility, all those will affect consequence. An example of this would be exposure or release if you're working with Candida albicans. What are the consequences of exposure or release of Candida albicans? Well, extremely low because it's a commensal, it's on your skin, it's in the environment, and there really is very little danger, if that were to be released or if you were to somehow be exposed to it, because you already are exposed to it, correct? So the consequence would be extremely low, which on the y-axis would be in the negligible range. And so that would definitely lower, even if the likelihood were high, unless it were extremely likely, as you can see on the x-axis, you probably don't need to add additional controls compared to what you're using, unless you're not using any. So I think that hopefully that makes that clear. I'll give an opposite example. If you were working with, let's say, Ebola, that would be a very high consequence pathogen. And so exposure to that virus, no matter how likely or unlikely, if you notice, the consequence is always severe. And the fewer controls you have, the more danger that you face. In other words, if the exposure is very likely because you don't have enough controls, then you're in that red zone of maximum containment measures. And as you add control measures, you lower the risk. You're going from the top right of that graph to the bottom left. And so that's pretty much how it works. The table here kind of shows if you have what consequences versus likelihood of exposure release look like. And it kind of simplifies this continuum on the graph. But procedures are really important. If you are working with a low consequence pathogen and you're pipetting or doing something where aerosolization is possible or a needle stick is possible, that's more even of an injury than if it's something very low consequence. And as a general rule, procedures where skin might be breached or aerosolization is possible definitely increase the likelihood that an incident or accident in the lab might occur, as you might imagine. So the more controls you add, the more you lower your risk. Last example here, if you're performing a high likelihood procedure using a high consequence pathogen, I've already kind of given that, but a good example would be inoculating cows in a field setting, lab field setting with anthrax. Why would you be doing that? And I'm sure it's been done, but you might not have the biological controls with which to reduce your level. So you have to make a decision based on what resources you have available, whether the work can be performed safely enough for you, for your lab director, or for your staff. And so that's how the decision is made to proceed or not, but we all want to use controls to lower our risk. And that's the risk assessment, simplified, okay? Here's a very good example of how the consequence is directly related to the pathogen, and that doesn't change. Here is an example of COVID-19 related assays, and this comes directly from the laboratory biosafety guidance related to coronavirus disease. And these interim guidance documents, there have been, I think, 4, I believe, but this is the most recent. And it shows how SARS-CoV-2, which is the pathogen, that's never going to change. But the test that you're doing will make a big difference. And also this shows how risk hazard group, which is a risk or hazard group, which is, RG2 or whatever the pathogen may be, is not equal to biosafety level. So it's an example of 2 different things, actually, and it's quite a good one. If you are working with SARS-CoV-2 in the laboratory, you may be testing samples using an antigen rapid diagnostic test. Because you're not pipetting or doing many things disruptive to your sample, and it's a closed cartridge, it's really kind of aligned with something like working in a clean room. It's BSL 0, because there's almost no risk that you're going to in any way contaminate the environment or yourself. Another example would be point of care assays or near point of care assays, oftentimes also cartridge assays, but there might be a pipetting step involved where you have potential exposure during that step. And these can be done in with very few controls, BSL1, equivalent of BSL1. I'm using BSL just and this is to show you about biosafety level, not equaling risk or hazard group. PCR or real-time PCR, that involves many disruptive processes, vortexing, pipetting, centrifuge, all of those processes, and those can produce aerosols. And so this procedure, more control should be applied. And so it's equivalent to a BSL2 situation where, ideally you have a biosafety cabinet, you have negative airflow, all those things that are going to protect you, and some kind of face covering or eye protection, something that's going to protect you from aerosolization. And then same pathogen, virus isolation, you're going to use a higher containment because if you're isolating or propagating a virus, you have a large amount of virus, which increases the likelihood that you're going to be exposed, and spills, because it's going to be in a liquid medium most likely. And so this increases your risk greatly, this high concentration of virus that you have more direct contact with. And so that would be a higher containment level than the other procedures. And then finally, very few of us are going to have anything to do with any manipulation of the actual nucleic acid, the virus. But if you were to do that type of experiment, it would be highly controlled and would require maximum containment, because any type of manipulation of a virus can have devastating consequences. So I think if it were released. So I think this was a great example that I borrowed, and thank you, because it really does show two of the concepts in one: how a risk group is not equal to biosafety level, and also how consequence, related to one single pathogen can, depending upon the procedure being done and the circumstances, different levels of containment will be used. So there you go. So I'm going to summarize. I'll still bring it up, but the risk-based approach. Most of this I've already shared, but the risk-based approach is flexible and locally applicable. And I've already described both of those things, that it's equitable, it can be used in any situation, and with different pathogens and different types of labs. And it's also very contextual. It's very locally applied to your very own laboratory. It's complementary to existing national regulations and is meant to enhance and support those rather than supersede them. And that's another very great advantage of this approach. It can be used, which I just stated, for all different types of laboratories, human, animal, etc., and private enterprises, any type of sector. It's intended to prevent exposure and release of infectious agents. And that's what you perform a risk assessment for. You're looking at the likelihood of exposure versus the consequences of if you were exposed, of exposure or release. And then one thing that I did not mention is that good microbiological practice and procedures, or GMPP, remains critically important. Your staff and their competence and how well they're trained in general laboratory practice is going to influence likelihood. How likely will an accident occur? Well, certainly if you have untrained staff, or you have folks that are not following GMPP, you are in that sense increasing the likelihood that an incident, LAI, or a release is going to occur. So this is critically important, that you maintain good training and competence among staff, and that serves as a control for any type of laboratory incident. So it will lower your risk. If you're the better trained and more competent your staff is, it'll lower your risk of, lower the likelihood, so therefore lower your risk of any type of laboratory accident. Okay, so I think I've covered risk assessment, certainly not fully, and we'll talk more, but there will be an upcoming webinar about risk assessment, because it is very foundational to the LBM-4. But now I'm going to talk about some of the other content, LBM-4 and its associated monographs, and some of the topics that are covered. An important section at the beginning is how do I use this laboratory biosafety manual? How will I get the most out of it? And so it's important to note, again, I'll state this again, that the manual should complement national regulations, not supersede them, and oversight mechanisms that may be in place, and be used to assess, control, and review risks at the local level. And local level meaning, well, it can mean a lot of things, but generally within one particular lab. It could be one procedure, and local level could be a team. So, I think the whole point is that it's very contextual and individualized. Depends on what resources you have. The LBM contents, fairly general, glossary of terms, for definitions that you might not quite understand from the text. certainly an introduction that describes changes. I'm going into much more detail with you here. There are 9 topic sections, references, because it is an evidence-based document. And so there are many references that you can refer to and maybe look further into some of the evidence that's been collected or further resources. And they do have a section of further resources. So that's important as well. I think the instructions, and I might have made this a little bit bigger text, for any given topic, if you're interested in learning more about a topic, say it's biosafety cabinets, the advice is, and ideally to use this manual, you first refer to the core document, which is the Laboratory Biosafety Manual for itself, and then follow by referring to the associated monograph when you need more detailed information, so that you can gain a better understanding of, whatever it is you're seeking to learn about, whether it's biosafety cabinets, waste management, or whatever. And so that's the advice. First, turn to the core document and then refer to a monograph. So here are the topics covered in the manual itself. I'll read some of these. I think you can read them though. And I've also highlighted those that there's a direct associated monograph. I think I might have missed a couple on the bottom of the bullets, because all of these are related to the monographs in some way, and several of them maybe to more than one. But risk assessment, control and review, we talked about the assessment process, a little bit about control, but nothing about review. So we will cover that in a later webinar. Core requirements, and you'll see that's kind of equivalent to BSL 1 and 2. Options for heightened control, the different types of biocontainment measures. But you notice they're very open-ended, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And not this biosafety level and this code. It's very open-ended, and how it's presented, which is very good for us, I think. Also has a topic, transfer and transportation of infectious substances, program management. There's a specific monograph about that. And then also, importantly, biosecurity and national and international biosafety oversight. And this is kind of list reading, I know, but I have a few things to say about some of these, and there'll be some more information. So the 7 associated monographs. This is great because you have somewhere to turn that deals specifically with topics in the same way and in the same language as the LBM-4. And so you can look for further information, and it also has its own references and some aids and helps like worksheets and various things like that. So the monographs are wonderful to learn more about a specific topic in the lab. And some of the more important, and I think recently, how should I say, probably frequently asked about or information requested would be, biosafety program management, risk assessment, biological safety cabinets, and other primary containment devices. There's a monograph that talks all about those. Personal protective equipment, how to properly don and doff, and what's appropriate to wear and when, which also is situational, but I think it's extremely, helpful to have a document that deals with this in its entire. Laboratory design and maintenance, decontamination, waste management, outbreak preparedness and resilience. What I notice about this is that it really there's very deep coverage on all these topics. So it's pretty broad, and so a lot of the topics within the laboratory core documents will be expanded quite a bit here. And these topics, most of these topics at the very least, will be covered in this webinar series. Webinar series will be based on not only the core document, but the associated monographs. So I wanted to look again at biological containment, because I think, that can be a bit of a point of confusion, this change, not only in the paradigm of, moving from biosafety levels that are discrete and very well defined to, having to perform a risk assessment to determine the best biosafety practices, which is actually much the better way because it can apply to everyone. And we've talked about a lot of those advantages. But I do want to show you that, I'm doing kind of a compare and contrast here. But the LBM3, the section 3 is basic laboratories, biosafety levels 1 and 2. Corresponding section 3 is called core requirements. And those are basically the minimum requirements for biosafety in order to prevent biological incidents. I mean, you can't always prevent them, but for minimum protection, basically, and what are the basics of biosafety, pretty much. Notice that the word training is used in our section is training in the LBM3, and it really refers to biosafety training, and it's not addressed very fully, whereas in the LBM4, personnel competence and training is the language. And I think that's really important because, you know, training is important, but without being able to evaluate that training and determine whether your personnel are competent or not, it's not very useful. And this is competent in whatever field that they're working in and that procedure, as well as biosafety training. And so I thought that was really important. Language is important here. So in section 4, the containment laboratory biosafety level 3, that's now called heightened control measures. So it's open-ended. Also, I really like measures because it kind of denotes an action, like the measures I'm going to take to heighten my control. I mean, it really describes it more fully, and it's less prescriptive and more based on resources and decision making as well. And so I think that's important. This is probably not as important, but health and medical surveillance is now occupational health, which is a term that we all understand much better and doesn't always denote that, you know, somehow you've gotten sick. I mean, I think the other terminology is almost scary, but occupational health is used throughout, and it makes a lot more sense. The maximum containment laboratory in section 5 is now called, instead of BSL4, maximum containment measures. You can't really get any higher than BSL4. I mean, I guess there can be layers upon layers of containment, but, you know, at some point, you know, you're as safe as you can possibly be, right? But they use the term code of practice in BSL, in LBM3, code of practice, which sounds like it's a set of rules that's very discrete. It's very descriptive in LBM4. Instead of code of practice, they talk about occupational working practices and procedures, which really describes what you'd be doing in operations. What practices and procedures would I be performing when I'm working? And so this, you know, just makes so much more sense. And I know it seems petty, but when you look at the language, it's actually really important to understanding how not open-ended, but how much personal responsibility you have in LBM4, whereas LBM3 is more of a set of rules. And, you know, that's how biosafety was. It's not, nobody's faulting anything. I think this is kind of the new paradigm that the world will now espouse. So it's a very exciting time, actually. One other thing that I wanted to point out about containment levels that's very exciting is that in the LBM4, all these topics are covered for all the biosafety levels or containment levels that are addressed in chapters in section 3, 4, and 5. And this is, you know, again, life cycle of the specimen. It's big coverage for sample receipt and storage, you know, accessioning. How do I store, you know, a sample for higher containment, you know, maybe higher risk group sample, et cetera. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because you can read through this, but the exciting piece is the life cycle of the sample. And also it takes you through decontamination and waste management. For the LBM3, it really didn't go into that much detail, particularly with the higher containment levels, except for facility equipment and the code of practice and laboratory design and equipment, that sort of thing. But all this in every section for every containment level, all these things are laid out, which is very comprehensive. And then kind of turning back, rather than going back to it, but I know you all remember the heat map that showed the different biocontainment levels. It's a continuum. And it's based on risk assessment as opposed to some prescriptive facility requirements. And that heat map is beautiful because it shows you, you could be anywhere on that map. It's not discrete, and it is based on your assessed risk, which can be comprised of many factors relating to likelihood, and we'll get into more detail about that. But there's a lot of factors that can either increase or decrease the likelihood of an incident or laboratory accident. So the continuum is a beautiful thing. So one other aspect that I'm going to share with you, there's so many, but one other aspect of the LBM-4 that is quite a bit different and really important is that there's a full treatment of laboratory biosecurity, and that's in section 8. Again, to compare and contrast, LBM-3 had a section on biosecurity, but it was very small and didn't have all these sections within it. I mean, it was not well developed, and this one is very well developed. It includes everything from risk assessment, inventory control, very important in biosecurity, particularly if you're working with high consequence pathogens. You need to know where your samples are at any given time and that they're going to stay where they are and not, be accidentally leaked into the environment or maybe purposely, stolen or something. Very seldom that kind of thing is going to happen, but that's part of inventory control, information control, protecting information of not only perhaps the public, if you're in a public health lab, or patients in a doctor's office. You don't want people to be able to access information about your patients, but also about what you're doing in the laboratory, particularly if you're working with the higher consequence pathogens. But any breach is bad. Personnel control, you need to know who's working for you. Not as much are they dangerous, or reliability is extremely important, and attitude. And so, knowing those things and monitoring those things amongst your personnel is extremely important for biosecurity. Physical security control, that's not just locks on doors, but it's, limiting access to the people who only people that should be in that laboratory. There's a lot more to it. Transport control, that's something that's often overlooked, but it's really important because that is a very weak spot in any kind of movement or chain of activities with a biological sample or infectious agent. And I would like, thinking about this, if you watch movies, when do the bad guys come and release their buddies? Always when they're being transported to and from the jail. Why? Because there is not a lot of security. There's a lot of different activities involved in transport that make it a weak link, in biosecurity. So I think that's really important that that's included. And then, of course, emergency and incident responses. Any kind of incident or emergency, particularly in public health, is a biosecurity issue. So if you have some kind of a fire in a laboratory, that's a huge biosecurity issue, because what are you going to do with all your samples? Another example would be even an outbreak like the pandemic we had. That's biosecurity. If something crosses into your borders, and from a public health standpoint, that's a biosecurity issue. If a disease crosses your borders that wasn't there before, whether you have control over it or not, it's a biosecurity issue. And then, and of course, merging biotechnology, CRISPR, other things that we read about. There's quite a bit of hubbub about, and I mean, I'm not saying that it's bad or good. I think it's important to be addressing these issues, that, some of these biotechnologies could be used in a bad way. And so we come to dual use research of concern, where any research you may be performing or might actually be used against the public or the environment by a bad actor, but even more commonly, accidentally create some kind of a public health or environmental concern. And it doesn't have to be high consequence pathogens. It could be a lot of different pathogens. So most institutions have review boards, and many of you are aware, for research that review different research projects that could potentially harm the public or the environment. And that's one thing that's addressed very well in this biosecurity section. And so I've talked for quite a good while, but I wanted to provide you with some resources. This slide really is describing what I've already talked about, but I'm providing links, direct links to the core document, as well as all of the monographs associated with the LBM4. And also some fantastic WHO resources, biosafety resources that I think really complement what we've talked about here today, as well as any biosafety program that you have. I've watched these videos, they're fantastic. I was extremely impressed. The good GMPP, I'm just going to say that. Those videos are fantastic. They go into several details about decontamination, PPE, donning and doffing with, visuals, which is wonderful. They show in some of these videos what not to do, but I found them extremely useful and very engaging, and I think you will too. And I think they're great training tools. Also, I took some screenshots shown here. One is about decontamination, and it shows how to mix the ethanol, and hand washing, which is kind of one that we all know how important it is, but when we're in a hurry, we might not be singing the full happy birthday song. This is a very good example of thorough hand washing. So all of the examples are excellent. And again, I encourage you to visit this series. It's the link is below. I think it was on YouTube. I'm not sure if it can be accessed directly that way, but this link below, I've tried it and it does indeed work. And so I encourage you to visit and use these biosafety training videos. They're wonderful. And then one other thing I wanted to bring forward is that WHO published a new manual or a new guidance document of model regulations and regulations for biosafety and biosecurity in biomedical laboratories. And this document is actually seminal and really important as well, because among member states, the regulatory situation with regards to biosafety and biosecurity is highly heterogeneous. Some laboratories are some countries rather are highly regulated, and they have detailed legislation and well-defined responsibilities for, ministers and laboratory directors and so on, and processes. Other countries, there may be some that don't have any regulations and want to have, biosafety, biosecurity legislation, standards, and regulations. Well, this document actually allows countries who either want to start, building that into their legislation, regulations for biosafety and biosecurity. A stepwise approach allows them to do that in a very, precise manner, and at a pace that's approachable. Also, for countries that may have regulations and want to update their regulations or strengthen them, or countries that already have highly regulated regulations but want to perhaps be aligned with other countries, and a kind of worldview regulation. I mean, I'm not saying that's a real common situation, but I think it does happen. So it's really intended for everyone, but particularly those laboratories or countries rather, that don't have regulations. Apologies for that. I'm going to skip through that. That's my disclaimer. And then I really had forgotten to put a slide together to acknowledge CARPHA and acknowledge Sasha and all the good folks that are hosting this call. But I want to particularly thank, and some of these folks are in the audience, and I appreciate you, particularly the editors of the Biosafety Manual. Huge effort, and what an excellent job was done. Contributors to all the monographs, and then others, WHO collaborating centers, of which INDRE, Canada, and US are here in the Americas. So PAHO, WHO collaborating centers, very big part in this manual, and also other agencies, which I won't go into. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing I think I appreciate your attention for this period of time, and hopefully I got my point across, and you can tell that I'm extremely excited about this manual, and I hope that you've become excited as well, because it really changes the way that we approach biosafety. And so I think it's going to have a huge positive impact on all laboratories.